Hey everyone, welcome back to Toasty TCG. So today in this video I'm going to be doing something a little bit different as I am planning to take a small hiatus from Yu-Gi-Oh for the next couple months. In this video I actually want to be talking about Magic, more specifically EDH. So over this year I've had a lot of time to put together in this deck due to coronavirus, pandemic, lockdown stuff. And I've been able to assemble this entire deck, mostly thanks to my locals. I have two of them I'm able to go to that was able to help me get this all set up. This is my very first EDH deck, so I want to give a huge shout out to everyone that helped me with this. And the reason that I wanted to build this is not for competitive reasons, but simply for the reason of showing up to locals early, and if there's anyone there who has like EDH decks on them, it just gives me something else to do while waiting for the Yu-Gi-Oh tournament to start. So unlike Yu-Gi-Oh, this is something I'm going to be doing a lot more casually than with Yu-Gi-Oh, where I've been going all over the place, playing tournaments all the time. This is something that I'm more so doing for the fun of just having something else to do on the side. So to start off, I'm going to talk about my commander. My commander that I've chosen to play is Kozilek, the Great Distortion. This monster costs 8 and 2 colorless, so it costs 10 altogether. When you cast it, you get to draw until there's 7 cards in your hand. And from what I understand, casting is simply just like revealing that this card's going to be coming to play. So before this card even comes into play, it's just like you're announcing you're going to put this card into play. That's when you draw 7 cards. Then it comes into play on the battlefield. So before your opponent's even able to like counter this with anything, you get that the cast trigger to draw you those 7 cards. Up next, this card has Menace, which means when it attacks, your opponent has to block with at least 2 monsters. They can't block with one, like do like a chump block with it. They have to block with at least 2. Then when your opponent activates a spell, you can discard a card with the equal converted mana cost as that spell to counter and negate it. So if they activate like a spell that costs 2 mana, you can discard a spell from your hand that costs 2 mana to negate it. And then it's just a 12/12, so it's very big. It does a lot of damage. 2 swings directly from this can kill someone due to the commander damage rule. It's something I actually learned very recently. And that's the commander. Up next, we've got 18 of these basic lands, wastes. They just tap for colorless. And then 16, I'm not sure what these are called. I'm not sure if they're called like effect lands or special lands. Let me know in the comments if these have like any kind of specific name to them. But to start off, you've got Thespian Stage and Vesuva. These 2 lands kind of do the same thing. So when Vesuva comes into play, you get to target a land on the field, and this becomes a copy of that land. Keep in mind, you're playing against 3 other people most of the time, so this card has a lot of utility. Anytime you put into play, you always have a wide variety of cards to target, but of course, when you put into play, you usually have a specific land in mind that you're going to target, but the card's always going to be very good when it does come into play. And then you've got Thespian Stage, which kind of does what Vesuva does, only it's a little bit slower because you have to pay 2 mana and tap it, and then it copies a land, just any target land. And you can also do this again later though, so if you have another land on the field, and you want this to copy that land instead of whatever it is currently copying, you have the option of paying 2 and tapping it again later to make it into a copy of a different land, so you can always just swap this out for something else. Whereas Vesuva, it comes into play and immediately comes a copy of whatever you originally targeted. You can't change that target to something else, unlike Thespian Stage. Alright, so up next, for more of the, I'm just going to keep calling them effect lands, we have Glimmer Post and Cloud Post. These are special lands called Locust Lands, and they have an ability if you have the other Locust land in play already. So with Glimmer Post, when it comes into play, you have to put it into play and you gain a life for every Locust land. And then of course it just taps for 1 mana. Whereas Cloud Post, when it comes into play tapped. But when you tap it later on to produce mana, it makes 1 mana for every Locust land. So if you already have both in play, this taps for 2. And then keep in mind that you can have Vesuva and Thespian Stage copy either of these. So if you have, say, Cloud Post, Vesuva can copy the Cloud Post, and then Cloud Post is now tapping for 2, as well as Vesuva now taps for 2, because keep in mind it is an exact copy of Cloud Post, so it even copies this land type. So Vesuva becomes a Locust land. And then same with Thespian Stage, so you can have up to 4 Locust lands in play at one time with these 4 lands. Then moving on, these are lands that all tap for 2 mana. You have Crystal Vein, Scorched Ruins, and Ancient Tomb. So Ancient Tomb just taps for 2 whenever you want to tap for 2, but you take 2 damage. Keep in mind though, you do have 40 life in Commander, so it's not a big deal. You're typically just going to use this card very early, produce a lot of mana, and get ahead. And then maybe eventually someone's just going to destroy this anyway, so you don't have to worry about it being like a dead land later on. Then there is Scorched Ruins. You have to get rid of 2 basic lands that are untapped, and this actually taps for 4 whenever you tap it. So that's really, really cool, but keep in mind you do lose those 2 basic lands. But this land is also very unfair. You go from 2 lands that just tap for 1 to being able to tap for 4. And then there's Crystal Vein. It kind of does the same thing as Ancient Tomb, but you have the option of tapping for 1 or tapping for 2. But when you tap for 2, you also have to sacrifice the Crystal Vein. So you really have to plan when you want to use Crystal Vein. You don't want to just put into play, tap for 2 mana, and then end up wasting the 1 mana or something like that. Or you already have the other mana in play to play whatever you want, so you want to be very careful with Crystal Vein. You have to make sure you're using it when you really need that 2 mana, and not just use it very, hazardously. And then up next, we have the Urza lands. I believe that's what they're called, the Urza lands. Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower. So, when you have one of these in play, it just taps for 1 mana normally. But when you have all 3 into play, one of these will tap for 3, and the other will tap for 2. So that means you can produce 7 mana if you have all 3 of these in play. It doesn't really come up too often, but it's still really cool if you pull it off. And then there is Darksteel Citadel. I only play this because it just taps for 1 colorless, but it's also indestructible, so land wipes don't really do anything against it. Just a really cool thing to have. And then Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. These just tap, they sacrifice themselves, and then you get a basic land into play tapped. So it's kind of just like a deck thin type of thing. It gets you land, or gets you an extra land. These could just be 2 more basic lands. They could also just be Terramorphic Expanses, not Terramorphic Expanse, Prismatic Vista, and then maybe basic land. There's not really too many lands I can think of that are fetch lands for colorless. If there are, let me know in the comments below if I'm missing something. These just seem like the best options to me outside of Prismatic Vista. But if there's a better option, definitely let me know in the comments below. Keep in mind, I have just started playing this game this year, so if I am missing anything, once again, just let me know. Mage Ring Network. This card's really cool, so when you put it into play, you have the option of it either tapping for 1, or you can tap it for 1 and tap for another mana with its second ability to get a counter on it. Then its third ability, you can tap it and remove counters from it, and then for every counter you remove, you get to produce 1 extra mana. So you can put this card into play on turn 1, then put another land into play on turn 2, and if you don't have something to cast, you can just tap this down and put a counter on it, so then every turn you're building up that counters, and then eventually you can crack this for all the counters and produce a lot of mana when you do have something to put into play. And then finally are the Eldrazi lands, Eldrazi Temple, Eye of Ugin, and Sanctum of Ugin. So, Eye of Ugin reduces the cost of your Eldrazi spells by 2, and then has another ability on here. You can pay 7 and tap it, search your library for a colorless creature, reveal it, and then put it into your hand. Then you have Eldrazi Temple. It taps for 1, or it taps for 2, but you can only use that 2 mana to put a Eldrazi card into play. And then finally, there's Sanctum of Ugin. It taps for 1, But when you play a colorless card with a converted mana cost of 7, you can sacrifice Eye of Ugin, or Sanctum of Ugin, to search a colorless card with a cost of 7 and put it in your hand. So that is the entire land base, and now we're going to move into some other stuff. So next up, I'm going to be talking about my removal cards. So to start off, we've got Warping Whale. This card it has 3 different options. You get to exile a 1-drop that has, well, 1 toughness. Then you have the option of countering a sorcery spell. And then finally, you get the option of putting a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature into play. And Scion tokens all have the ability of tapping themselves or sacrificing themselves to produce 1 colorless mana. So typically you're using the first 2 abilities, if I'm not mistaken, to either counter or to deal with something that has 1 toughness. And keep in mind it's instant, so if I'm not mistaken, if a creature has its toughness reduced to 1 through battle, then I believe you can use this to exile that creature. Then next up is Spatial Contortion. This card is also an instant. It lets you give a creature +3/-3, so you can use it for 2 different things, I suppose. You can use it as a kill spell for anything that has 3 or less toughness, or you can use it as a way to buff your creatures that you want to attack with, and it only costs 2 mana, so it's another very good card in this deck. Then as a 3-drop, there is Titan's Presence. When you cast this card, you reveal a colorless creature in your hand, and then you target a monster on the field that has a lower converted mana cost, I believe. A creature with power less than or equal to the revealed card's power, not lower mana cost. So you target a creature with lower power than the card that you revealed, and then you exile that card. So if you reveal a very big creature, and then you use as Titan's Presence, you can exile pretty much any creature on the board. Next up is actually a Planeswalker here. We've got Ugin the Spirit Dragon. So this card, I was actually kind of on the fence about playing because I didn't really read these last 2 abilities. With Planeswalkers, so far I've really just been focusing on these plus abilities. But this minus ability is really cool. So with this creature, you can pay X, where X is the number of loyalty counters on it, and then exile colored cards with a converted mana cost equal to or lower than what X is. So if you put Ugin into play and then you pay all 7 of his loyalty counters, you get to exile every colored card on the field with 7 or less converted mana cost. So it's a really cool board wipe, and it's very versatile because you just have the other options as well. And then next up is Gruesome Slaughter. This turns all your creatures into getting the ability to tap themselves and deal damage to target creature, where you deal its power into their toughness. So, from what I've learned in Magic, you can't attack your creatures into other creatures. You have to always attack directly. So, sometimes it can be very difficult to remove creatures in this game. This is pretty much just a board wipe in most cases, because you can just tap down all these big creatures on your board, and then start killing all the problem cards on the field. Then there is Scour from Existence. This is a 7-drop instant, and it just says exile target permanent, so it's removal for pretty much any card in the game. That's really neat. And then finally for our removal is All Is Dust. This card is each player sacrifices all colored permanents that they control. So that includes artifacts, creatures, enchantments. It doesn't include lands though, because I believe lands technically aren't colored permanents from what I've read, because I had to double check. I was pretty certain this would get rid of lands too, but it doesn't. Just get rid of all their battle card, basically, anything that they enchant, their artifacts, like I've already mentioned. This card's really cool. It just deals with all the problem cards and just puts everyone except yourself at a disadvantage, just because it gets rid of so much. It deals with a lot of things in this game, I think. Up next, I'm going to be talking about cards that are called Mana Rocks and Mana Dorks. In this deck, there's a lot of very big creatures they want to put into play. And you don't want to be waiting until like turn 10 to be playing your commander, so you play like a lot of these cards to get to your commander as early as possible. So to start off, this is a 0-cost card called Everflowing Chalice, but you don't want to play it for 0. You typically want to play it for turn 2 at the very least. It has a ability called Multi-Kicker, where you can pay increments of 2 to put a counter on this card. And then this card taps for every counter on it. So if you pay 2, you get 1 counter. If you pay 4, you get 2 counters, and so on. Just taps times 2 for every counter you put on it. So this card becomes increasingly good the later you go into the game, because there's points where you just have all these artifacts and lands on the board, but you're producing so much mana that like you have extra mana to spare. So when you see this card later in the game, you can just use all that extra mana up to play this card, and then it just taps for so much more. It's a very powerful card, and then it's also very good early on in the game, because I really feel that Mana Rocks should tap for 2 if they're going to produce 1, then tap for 4 if they're going to produce 2, or tap for 3 and produce 2. 3 is very early, I think, to tap for 2, but if you're paying like 3 mana or 4 mana, you don't want to have a Mana Rock that taps for 1. I think 2 mana for 1 to tap for 1 mana is very good. So this card is pretty much good at every point of like your mana curve. And then next up is Lotus Petal. This card just sacrifices itself to produce any color of mana. So you can play this card at any time. It costs 0, and then you can just tap it, get 1 mana, and you sacrifice it. Up next is Mana Crypt. This card taps for 2 colorless mana, and it's also a 0-cost card. But the downside is every upkeep you have to flip a coin. If you call it wrong, you take 3 damage. So, 50% of the time you're going to be taking some damage from this card, but it is worth it to produce 2 mana. It can also do this on turn 1. Even if for somehow you keep a hand where you have like no lands in it, you still have this card to put into play on your very first turn. Up next is Mana Vault. This card taps for 3 mana, I believe, but it doesn't untap. You have to pay 3 mana to untap it. And then if it is tapped during your upkeep, you take 2 damage, I believe. Now you must pay 4 mana during your upkeep to untap it, and if it is tapped during your upkeep, you take 1 damage. So this card is still really good just because tapping for 3, and this is another card that you can play on turn 1 because it only costs 1, so you can play a land, tap your land, put this into play, and now you're suddenly on turn 4 basically. Because now you have your 1 land producing a mana, and you have this being able to produce 3 mana, and then you can use this to put more rocks into play, and this card just ramps very quickly. So by the time that you're at that point where it's like you're taking damage from this, you can just tap that 4 mana to untap this. And there's also ways of untapping this without paying that 4 mana that I'll talk about later too. Next up is Sol Ring. This is like a very staple card in Commander from what I've seen. It is another 1-drop mana rock, and it just taps for 2 mana. So it's pretty much like a Mana Crypt, only it costs 1 more, which doesn't even matter, and you don't take damage, so this card is just extremely good. And it's also very cheap to afford, so this is a very go-to card for deck building, I found. Then for our creature mana dorks is Walking Atlas and Mannequin. This card just taps for 1. Every turn you get 1 mana. And then Walking Atlas, you can tap it to put an extra land into play. And then we've got some 2-drop mana rocks, starting with Cold Steel Heart. So this card actually comes into play tapped, and then when it enters the battlefield, you can choose a color, adds 1 mana of that chosen color to your mana pool every single turn. So it's just 1 mana, you pay for 2, and then every turn you have 1 extra mana every turn. And then there is Fractured Power Stone. This is another one that just costs 2 and pays for 1 mana, so you get an extra mana every turn. Then is Prismatic Lens. This card, once again, you pay 2 mana, and then every turn you can tap it to produce 1 mana, but it also says you can pay 1 and tap 1 to add 1 mana of any color, which isn't relevant to this deck. So everything is colorless in this. Next up is Mind Stone, another one that costs 2 and taps for 1. But this one actually has a kind of interesting effect where you can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice Mind Stone, and then you get to draw an extra card. Then there is Felwar Stone. This card taps for any mana that your opponent's cards can produce, or any lands, I believe. Any lands that your opponent can produce, this can tap for. And once again, it only costs 2 mana. Then there is Thought Vessel. This card says you have no maximum hand size, and once again, you can tap it to produce 1 mana. Up next is a 3-drop mana dork called Metalworker. This card is tap itself, then you reveal artifacts in your hand, and then you produce 2 mana for every artifact you revealed. So, in theory, if you tap it and then reveal your Thought Vessel, you produce 2 mana, and then you can use that 2 mana to cast your Thought Vessel. And then for our 3-drop rocks is Worn Power Stone. This is, you pay 3, of course, like I just mentioned, and it taps for 2 mana. Then there is Basalt Monolith. This card is, it costs 3, of course. It taps for 3, and then it doesn't untap in your upkeep, but you can pay 3 to untap it. Then for our 4-drop rocks, there is Thrawn Dynamo. This is, of course, 4, and it taps for 3. And then for our final rock is Empowered Auto Generator. This card comes into play tapped, and then every turn you can tap it to put a charge counter on it, and then it produces 1 mana for every charge counter. So every time that you tap this card, it produces 1 more mana. So the first time that you tap it, it will go for 1, the next turn it will go for 2, 3, 4, you get the idea. Every turn this card just gets bigger and bigger. It's really neat once it starts going off, and once this card just gets like really big, it just spirals out of control because it just produces all that mana. Alright, next up I'm going to talk about some more artifact cards, but these cards are more like utility things. They're made to keep the deck's like engine going and keep like all the stuff that you want where it is. To start off, there is Expedition Map. This is a 1-drop that taps for 2, and you get to sacrifice it and search any land card from your deck and put it in your hand. So by turn 3 usually, you can tap this and get whatever land you need. Next up is Sensei's Divining Top. This card lets you pay 1 to look at the top 3 cards of your deck and put them in any order that you want, as well as tap it to put it on top of your deck and then draw the card on top. So you draw the card and then put this card on top, not the other way around, because that would just mean you put it on top and then draw it. And there's actually an infinite loop with this card that I'm going to show you guys in a bit. I'm sure like anyone that's like into Magic and is like just watching this video as like another Magic video to watch, I'm sure you guys already know the loop, but for anyone who doesn't, I'm still going to show you guys the infinite loop of this. Then is Wayfarer's Bauble. This is kind of like the Expedition Map. It taps for 2 and itself to sacrifice it, but instead of searching a land, you get any basic land, which is pretty much just the wastes, and you get the waste into play tap, I believe. Then is Helm of Awakening. This card, it costs 2, and it makes all spells cost 1 less, but that actually includes everyone at the table, so if you play this card, you really want to play it in a deck that's like ramp heavy like this, because you don't want to be playing this and giving your opponent like a really big setup by making all their cards cheaper as well. You have to like make sure that this card's worth it in your deck, whereas in Eldrazi, I feel it's very worth it to be playing this card. Then is Sword of the Animist. This also comes into play for 2, and it equips to a creature for 2. That creature gets +1/+1, and whenever that equipped creature attacks, you get to search your deck for a basic land, I believe, and put that basic land into play tapped. Yep, it has to be a basic land, it comes into play tapped. Then next up is Scroll Rack. This card costs 1 and you tap itself. Oh, actually it costs 2, but its ability costs 1 and you tap it to put cards in your hand to the side, and then you draw that many cards that you put to the side, and you take those cards you put to the side and put them on top of your deck. So it kind of lets you take, say, something that you can't cast this turn, or maybe it takes cards that like you're not going to be able to use for a couple turns, put them on your deck, and then see if you can draw something that's a little more useful right away, and then maybe later down the line, you'll draw into those cards that you've set on top of your deck, and you'll be in a situation where you can use them now. And then there is Herald's Horn. This card lets you call a creature type. We'll be calling Eldrazi in this, and that creature type costs 1 less. But then also, during every one of your upkeeps, you get to look at the top card of your deck, and then if it is the creature type that you declared, you get to add that card to your hand. So with this card, you can essentially draw 2 during your upkeeps if you're lucky and have that monster type on top of your deck. Then there is Sculpting Steel. When it comes into play, it becomes a copy of a target artifact. So you can just put it into play and you copy like a mana rock, so you can just get like extra mana, or you can copy like one of these like utility type cards, so you can have like an extra effect going on. And then next up is Crucible of Worlds. This lets you play lands from your drop area. So you know, like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, you can take those cards, put them into play again, and then tap them to get another basic land out of your deck. So this just means if you don't have lands in your hand and you have lands in your drop area, you're able to use those lands instead, so you don't have to worry about like missing a land drop every turn. And then is Urza's Incubator. This card is similar to Herald's Horn, where you declare a creature type, but instead of it costing 1 less, it actually just costs 2 less, so it just makes Eldrazi a little cheaper to put into play. Next up is Clock of Omens and Unwinding Clock. So these lands each have the ability of untapping your artifacts. They just do it a little bit differently from the other. So Clock of Omens has the ability where you tap 2 artifacts, and then you untap a target artifact. So keep in mind, you can tap Clock of Omens itself and then one other artifact. Typically, like one of these utility lands that don't need to be tapped, you can just tap that card down and it's still going to have its ability, and you can untap like a mana rock so you can get more mana out of it, of course. And Unwinding Clock, or Clock of Omens, works especially good with things like Mana Vault and Basalt Monolith that don't untap, so you're able to untap them right away. And then you don't have to worry about like going to upkeep and you can take damage. Then there is Unwinding Clock, where at the beginning of everyone's upkeep, this card untaps all of your artifacts. So untap all artifacts at the beginning of each other player's upkeep. So every turn you're able to untap all your artifacts, which again means that you can tap them back down to produce mana and play like instants or things like that. And at the next player's upkeep, you get to untap your artifacts all over again, and you can do the same thing. It's really neat. Once again, they untap your things like your Mana Vault and your Basalt Monolith as well, cards that don't untap on their own. Next up, we've got Mystic Forge. This card is really broken. This card's absolutely insane. It lets you look at the top card of your deck at any time, and you can cast that card on top of your deck. You can also tap this and then pay 1 life, exile the top card of your library. So if you don't like what you see, you can just tap it and get rid of that card. And then keep in mind then that also means you can look at the next card, and if you like that card, you can put that card into play by paying its mana cost. This card's really broken and unfair. I think it's like one of the best cards I've ever read. If it ever existed in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the card would be banned. Next up is Quicksilver Amulet. You pay for it to put into play, and you can pay for and tap it to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. This doesn't count as casting it though, so if that card has like any like cast triggers, it will miss those cast triggers. Next up is Mirrorworks. This card says whenever an artifact comes into play that is not a token artifact, you can pay 2 mana and make a copy of that artifact. So let's go back to, say, your Quicksilver Amulet, for example. You can make a copy of your Quicksilver Amulet, and now if you have 4 mana open, you can tap this, put a creature in the battlefield, you can tap the token, and put another creature into the battlefield. Really cool card, works with pretty much everything in this deck, except like things like the Mystic Forge, where you're already able to use its ability, you don't need a copy of it, and you can like copy your mana rocks. This card is really cool, it does a lot for the deck, it's very versatile. And then next up is our first 5-drop utility artifact. I believe this is from the newest set, Zendikar Rising, Forsaken Monument. This is really cool, it's actually a full art card. So the colorless creatures you control all get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a mana source or a permanent for 1 colorless mana, it adds another. Or not even just 1 colorless mana. If it taps to produce a colorless mana in general, you get 1 extra. So, for example, if you tap Soul Ring for 2 mana, instead it produces 3 mana. This card's really cool, and then it has one more ability, where whenever you cast a colorless spell, you just gain 2 extra life. The big payoff here, though, is the second effect, where every time that you tap anything for colorless, you get 1 extra. So that even includes like your lands. You tap a land, you're now producing 2 mana for every land that you tap, rather than just 1. Then we got Tamio's Journal. So this card, every turn it will produce a token, and when you have 3 of those tokens, you can sacrifice all 3 to search any card from your deck. Alternatively, these tokens have the ability of tapping themselves, and then they produce they don't produce mana, but it lets you draw a card. So you can either sacrifice those 3 tokens that you produce, or you can sacrifice them individually for different effects. You can either draw a card, or you can just search your library for any card that you want. Then there is the Immortal Sun. This card is also really cool. Turns off all Planeswalker loyalty abilities. At the beginning of all your upkeeps, you get to draw an extra card, so you're drawing 2 every turn. And then finally, spells that you cast cost 1 less. And actually, now is finally, creatures you control get a +1/+1. So this card's really cool. It has 4 very good effects. Negating Planeswalkers, making you draw 2 every turn, making your cards cheaper, and making your cards bigger. And then finally, for the utility cards, I probably could have put this in like my card removal segment, but I guess it works here too. This card it can counter a target spell that targets one of your colorless creatures. However, if the targeted creature costs 7 or more, you are able to play this card without paying its mana cost of 7. So that's usually what you're doing, is you're holding on to it and kind of using it like a hand trap in Yu-Gi-Oh! So once your big creature gets targeted, so you can try to like get rid of it, you can use this to negate that. Now finally, I'm going to be talking about the infinite combo with this card. So if you control either the Immortal Sun, Helm of Awakening, or a creature card that I'm going to be showing you guys soon, and then you control Mystic Forge, you have an infinite loop where you can draw cards. How this works is these cards both make every card that you want to cast cost 1, and Sensei's Divining Top costs 1. So you can put Sensei's Divining Top into play for free. Now you have Mystic Forge, which says you can look at the top card of your deck, and you can put it into play if you can pay its mana cost. Now, let's go back to Sensei's Divining Top. This card has the ability that I talked about before, where you get to tap it, draw a card, and then put this on top of your deck. So, let's look at it this way. Let's take our land pile back right here, and say this is part of our deck right now. So, we have our deck here, and then we have like 1 land into play, something like that. So, you're able to tap this, now you draw a card, you put this back on top of your deck, and then with Mystic Forge, you're able to look at the top card of your deck, and you're able to cast it because of these cards, it costs 0, so you can put it into play. And once again, you have the ability to tap it, you can draw a card, put it back to the top of your deck, and you see where this goes. You're able to just, every time this card goes back on top of your deck, you can just look at it with Mystic Forge, and then it costs 0 because of either of these cards. You can just put it right back into play, and this is just infinite draws. You just tap this as many times as you want, draw as many cards as you want. It's really cool, and I actually didn't notice this when I had this combo set up a couple weeks ago. Some people, like, they had to show me how this combo works. I had this all on the board, and they're kind of like giving each other like weird looks. I was like, what's going on here? Am I doing something wrong? And then it was only after the game had ended that they showed me this really awesome combo. Like I said, you just use these 3 cards to draw infinitely. So that makes up all like the utility lands and all the utility like artifact type cards. Next up, I want to talk about like mid-range, like mid-game creatures. Alright, so next up I'm going to be talking about all like the mid-game creatures. These are things that you typically want to be putting into play in like turn 2, 3, 4, 5. And then by then, like, you have like turn 6, 7, 8 where you start like putting all like your big guys into play. So to start off, we're going to be having Mad Reshaper. This card costs 3, including 1 colorless. It's a 3/2, and when it dies, you get to look at the top card of your deck, and if it costs 3 or less, you can put it into play for free. Otherwise, you put it into your hand. So it's pretty much like a chump blocker, and then once it dies, you get a +1 off of it. Up next is Foundry Inspector. This card just says all artifacts cost 1 less. This is another card that works with the Sensei's Divining Top combo, because once again, Sensei's Divining Top is an artifact, so it costs 0 because of Foundry Inspector, so you're able to do that infinite loop with this card as well. Then is Thought-Knot Seer. When this card comes into play, it costs 3 and a colorless, so 4 altogether. And when it comes into play, you look at target opponent's hand, and you exile a card from their hand. Then when this card dies, that player who lost the card gets to draw a card, but what matters here is that you're able to look at their hand and take a problem card right out of it. And then we have Reality Smasher. It costs 4 and a colorless, so 5 altogether. And it has Trample, and it has Haste. And whenever it becomes the target of an opponent's card, they have to sacrifice, or they have to discard a card, I believe. They have to discard a card, otherwise Reality Smasher will immediately counter that card. So it'll just negate whatever targets it, unless that person gets rid of the card. So it just discourages people from dealing with this card. And then is Walker of the Wastes. This is just like Reality Smasher. It costs 4 and a colorless, so 5 altogether. And it has Trample, and it gets +1/+1 for every waste that you control. So keep in mind there's 18 wastes in this deck, so typically when you put this card into play, it'll come out as like an 8/8 with Trample, which is really cool, and it's able to swing in for a lot of damage most of the time that you play it. Then we got Geode Golem. This card has Trample, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to cast your commander for free. So that means that Kozilek will not miss the cast trigger, like with Quicksilver Amulet, where it only puts the card in the battlefield. Geode Golem just says to cast your commander for free. So it gets that cast trigger, you get to draw all those cards, and then you just have this big 12/12 on the battlefield on like turn 4 or 5. Next up is Conduit of Ruin. When this card comes into play, you get to take a colorless creature with a cost of 7 or greater and add it to your hand, or put it on top of your deck, and then every turn the first colorless card that you play costs 2 less. It's a cost 6 to put into play, it's a 5/5, just another card that you're typically putting into play like turn 4 or 5. Next up is Oblivion Sower. When this card comes into play, you get to target an opponent, they exile the top 4 of their deck, and then you take all the lands out of that top 4 and you take control of them. So this is another card that can kind of help you ramp. It's like a mid-game card. Once again, you're putting into play like turn 4, turn 5, with all the ramp rocks, or the mana rocks you have, so you're able to get this card out very early and then get into more ramp. And then next up is Wormcoil Engine. When this card comes into play, it doesn't do anything, but it has Death Touch and Lifelink. But when it dies, it makes 2 Worm tokens that are pretty much just like a half of Wormcoil Engine. There are 3 3s with Power and Toughness 3/3, whereas Wormcoil Engine is a 6 with Power and Toughness 6/6. And then 1 token has Lifelink and 1 token has Death Touch. So you pretty much just split Wormcoil Engine right down the middle and get 2 just tokens that are very good. This card's very versatile. Once again, discourages people from dealing with it and from attacking you, because if you block with this, you're killing whatever it's blocking, and then you're also getting that lifelink, dealing 6 damage to something, so you're gaining 6 life. And then, even when they kill this card, you just get 2 tokens that do the same thing as this card. Then is Karn, Scion of Urza. This card I really just play for the +1 ability. It's +1, you look at the top 2 cards of your opponent hand with at a target opponent chooses 1. One of that target card goes to your hand, the other card gets exiled with a counter on it, and then it has a -1 ability to add any card with one of Karn's counters on it. When you play it, you get to +1, you get a free card to your hand, and then on your next turn you do the -1 to get whatever was exiled if you want it, or you can just do its +1 ability again and get another card to your hand. The downside, of course, is your opponent being able to choose. And then finally is Ugin the Ineffable. This card says that all colorless cards you want to cast cost 2 less, and then it has the ability of exiling the top card of your deck face down, and then you get a 2/2 Spirit Token. When that Spirit Token dies, you just get to take that card you exiled from this ability and add it to your hand. So, for example, we'll take Sanctum of Ugin is on the top of our deck, you exile it for a token, and then when that token dies, maybe like combat damage or something, you get that Sanctum of Ugin that was exiled to your hand. So what I typically like to do is, instead of exiling it, I'll just put it onto the field face down, so because I don't really have too many tokens. So that way we can remember that this card was put into play by Ugin, so once this card dies, I'm going to put this card in my hand instead of trying to remember, like, what card is exiled by Ugin, things like that. Just, like, saves time and is less difficult to remember. And now finally, we have our game winner cards. These are cards that you're going to put into play to just finish the game off. Starting off is Endless One. This card costs X, so you can pay any amount that you want into it. And when it comes into play, it gets a 1/1 counter for every X that you paid. So if you paid like 10 mana to play this card, you now have a 10/10 on the field. This card's just really good late game because it gets really big. I remember one time I actually played this card, it was a 20/20, so there's just like no way to deal with it at that point. It was just super big, and it was able to just like finish off the game. Next off is Artisan of Kozilek. Whenever you cast this card, you get to target a creature in your grave, and you get to play it. So this card is like a 2-for-1, you cast it, you get a free card out of your grave as well. Then is Void Winnower. This card just tells your opponent that they can't even. Anytime that they have like an even converted mana cost card in their hand, or a creature on the field they want to block with, they're not able to do either of those things. Anything that's 0, 2, 4, 6, and so on, they can't use any of those cards, they can't cast them, they can't block with them. I believe, however, if it's like an even converted mana cost artifact, they can probably tap those. Yeah, they can't cast spells with an even cost, and they can't block with creatures that have an even cost. Then up next is Kozilek, the Butcher of Truth. This card's similar to the Kozilek I'm using as commander. When you cast it, you get to draw 4 cards, and then has a really, really insane ability called Annihilator 4. So, how Annihilator works is, when this card attacks, your opponent has to sacrifice permanents they control equal to the number next to Annihilator. I forgot to mention that Artisan of Kozilek has a Annihilator 2. This card has Annihilator 4, so whenever it attacks a opponent, that person has to sacrifice 4 permanents they control, and that can even include their lands. So it can get rid of any of their artifacts, their creatures, their lands, get rid of anything that your opponent can have on the board. They have to sacrifice 4 of those cards. And then finally, if they even do kill this creature, when it does go to the graveyard, you get to shuffle your entire graveyard into your library, including this card, of course. And then next up, we have got Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre. This card also has a casting cost, or a casting ability. It costs 11 to put into play, and when you cast it, you get to destroy a target permanent. So that just means any card in play you can destroy, and once again, it's a casting cost, so before they even get a chance to counter or anything, you have to destroy something. Then there is Indestructible, and finally it has Annihilator 4. And then there is the same ability as Kozilek. When this creature dies, you get to shuffle your entire grave into your deck. It's hard to get rid of, though, because it does have Indestructible. And once again, Annihilator 4, super, just insane ability. Metalwork Colossus. We're playing a ton of artifacts, so this card usually comes out to play for free, because it costs 11, but you get to reduce the cost of it for every artifact. Well, every non-creature artifact you control. So, say for example, you have Assault Monolith, Thrawn Dynamo, and Empowered Auto Generator. So you have 4, 8, 9, 10, 11. So you can play your Metalwork Colossus for free because you have artifacts whose converted mana cost equals 11. So you just get a 10/10 out for free. It's a really cool card. Next up, Lightsteel Colossus. This is the alternate art from Double Masters. has Trample, Infect, and Indestructible. This card is really great because it has these 3 really good abilities, and it also works similar to the Eldrazi Titans, but instead of putting your whole grave into your library, it'll just put itself from the grave into the library. Now, these 3 abilities are really cool because the Trample, Infect, and Indestructible, so it's hard to remove. And then whenever it swings, if your opponent doesn't block, it'll deal 10 Infect damage immediately, killing them. And if they block with something that only has 1 toughness, it'll run over with 11, doing 10 trample damage, killing them. So that means if they block with anything that has less than 2 toughness, this creature will immediately just take them out of the game. And like I already mentioned, Indestructible, so it's very difficult to get rid of. I like this card a lot. It's just like it's a game winner in itself. And then next up we've got It That Betrays. This card has Annihilator 2, and whenever your opponent sacrifices a permanent, you take control of that permanent. And keep in mind, Annihilator 2 means that they have to sacrifice 2 cards every time that this card attacks. And when they sacrifice those cards, you get the continuous ability of It That Betrays, taking control of those 2 cards that just got sacrificed. And then for our final, big game-winning card is Emrakul, the Promised End. This card costs 13, but you can make it cost 1 less for every card type in your grave. That means lands, creatures, artifacts, enchantments, things like that. So I believe you can get this card out for 8 mana, if I'm not mistaken. And then when you cast it, you can target an opponent and take control of their turn. So that means when their turn comes up, you choose all of their actions. You draw for their turn, you untap their lands, you can play their cards. What's really cool about Magic is you can choose to fail to find when you search. So you can, when you take control of your opponent's turn, you can play a card that might search the library and then declare fail to find. And they don't get that card back like in Yu-Gi-Oh! Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh! It would be an illegal move to not be able to find a card that you're searching for. So with this, you can just put something into play on their turn, you can waste all their resources, and just put them in a very bad position. And then keep in mind, this card has Trample, Flying, and Protection from instants. So I believe Protection means it's unaffected by anything that might target it. Correct me if I'm wrong once again in the comments below. But that's the final card to win the game with. It's your final big bomb card. But guys, that about wraps up this video. Once again, this is my very first time making a Magic-based video. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you have any advice, any suggestions, any changes to this deck, any changes to the way I did this video, let me know. Just any kind of constructive criticisms that you might have to help me improve my Magic content. It was a lot of fun to make. So I made this entire deck just for the fun of having a Magic deck. And Magic I've been having a lot of fun with. There's a lot of times you play against 3 other people, and a lot of crazy things happen, a lot of blowout cards, a lot of things where you team up with people to take someone else down, or maybe 2 people team up to take you down. I'm having a great time with this, so you guys might see more Magic content in the future if you enjoyed this video. But also, while you're down in the comments, check out the description. You can find a link to my TCG player affiliate link. It helps the channel directly anytime that you buy cards using that link, paying for cards you're already going to get anyway, and of course it costs you no extra expenses to your own, it's just you're buying cards, and some of that helps support the channel. And then you can also find our Discord link, so join our Discord, check that out. Facebook, so make sure to follow the Facebook and get updates on Toasty TCG. So guys, once again, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is Toasty TCG signing out.